The night Ellison Vance handed his wife a gift box in front of 200 people. He was smiling the way men smile when they are absolutely certain they have won something. Ingrid Vance, 37-year-old wife of Ellison Vance, stood at the center of the Meridian Club's grand reception hall, her own anniversary dinner, organized by her husband, attended by his colleagues, his family, his world, and accepted the box with both hands. The room had gone quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when everyone is watching and pretending not to. Champagne flutes paused mid-air. Ellison's father, Howard Vance, 68, stood near the bar with his chest pushed out, already nodding like a man who had rehearsed his pride in advance. Ingrid did not open the box immediately. She looked at Ellison first. He was still smiling. She opened it. Inside, resting on a cushion of white silk, was a bracelet, platinum, 3 rows of round-cut diamonds, the clasp engraved with a small tulip motif. It was exquisite. It was the kind of piece that made women across the room exhale softly, the kind of piece that got photographed and posted and admired for weeks. Ingrid looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked back at Ellison, then at the bracelet again. "Do you like it?" he asked, loud enough for the tables nearest them to hear. "Before I answer," Ingrid said, her voice perfectly even, "I'd like to have it authenticated." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence entirely. Ingrid Pemberton had not always been this careful. There was a version of her, not so many years ago, though it felt like another lifetime, who believed that love was proof enough of everything, who thought that a man who chose you was a man who saw you. She had believed this with the particular stubbornness of someone who had built her confidence late and held on to it fiercely once she had it. She met Ellison at a conference in Atlanta 11 years ago. He was in commercial real estate. She was, at the time, the head of product development at a mid-size accessories label called Breyer & Stone. They were seated at the same dinner table on the second night, and Ellison had made her laugh 3 times before the appetizers arrived. He was charming in a way that felt earned rather than rehearsed, or at least she had believed that then. They married 3 years later. A small ceremony in Savannah, Georgia, overlooking the river, with Spanish moss and late afternoon light, and 47 guests, who all agreed it was the most beautiful wedding they'd attended in years. For a while, it was good. Then it became comfortable. Then comfortable became something harder to name, a kind of distance that lived in the same house as them, ate at the same table, slept in the same bed, and was never once acknowledged out loud. What Ellison did not know, what he had never once thought to ask about in any serious way, was what Ingrid had been building for the past 6 years in the hours he assumed she spent on calls with her work friends or her little side project. Ingrid had not always been quiet about her ambitions. In the early years of their marriage, she had talked openly about what she wanted to build. A luxury accessories house, something with a real point of view, American craftsmanship, transparent sourcing, pieces that were made to last decades, not seasons. She had a name for it already. She had a vision board she kept in a drawer in her home office. Ellison had listened, nodded, and on more than one occasion referred to it as the hobby in front of other people. She stopped talking about it to him after the 3rd time. She started building it instead. The company was called Vellum & Thorn. It launched quietly 6 years ago with a single collection, 14 pieces, small batch production, distributed to 3 boutiques, and an online presence so understated it looked almost accidental. The fashion press barely noticed. That was by design. By the 2nd year, Vellum & Thorn had a waitlist. By the 4th year, it had been profiled in 3 international publications, worn by 2 Grammy attendees and a sitting senator's wife, and expanded to a flagship studio in Charleston. By the time Ingrid stood in the Meridian Club holding that gift box, Vellum & Thorn was valued at just over $60 million, with a licensing deal pending that would push that number considerably higher. Ellison Vance did not know any of this. He knew his wife had her business. He had signed one document early on, something about LLC formation, and he had not asked about it again. When Ingrid worked late, he ordered takeout. When she traveled for what she called supplier meetings, he made plans with his own friends. The arrangement suited him. He liked a wife who was occupied enough not to be demanding and present enough to appear at dinners like this one. What he did not understand, what none of the Vance family understood, was that Ingrid had not been present at all in the way they imagined. She had been somewhere else entirely, building something they would eventually recognize. She had simply been doing it without an audience. Howard Vance had been talking about Vellum & Thorn for 8 months. He didn't know that was what he was doing. He knew it as a brand he had encountered at a charity auction in Charlotte. A platinum cuff that had caught his eye, price point that had impressed him, a name he'd started dropping in conversation, the way men drop names when they want to signal taste. He'd given Ellison's mother, Doris Vance, 65, a Vellum & Thorn silk wrap for their anniversary. He'd told 3 of his golf partners about it. He'd called it the kind of American luxury that still means something. He said this at dinner once, at the very table where Ingrid was pouring his iced tea. "There's this brand," Howard said, gesturing with his fork, "that Doris and I have been following, Vellum and Thorn. Ellison, you should look into gifting something from them, real quality, the kind of thing that shows you have taste." Ellison had nodded and glanced at his phone. Ingrid had refilled Howard's glass and said nothing. That night in their bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before she decided what she was going to do. Not out of anger. She had moved past anger some time ago, out of clarity. She had been patient for a very long time. She had been the kind of patient that looks like accommodation, but it's actually something else, something quieter and more purposeful. She called her attorney the next morning. She called her studio director the morning after that. And then she waited. The anniversary dinner had been Ellison's idea, or rather, it had been the idea of Ellison's colleague Prescott, 44, who was known for throwing elaborate events and who had suggested that Ellison's 10th wedding anniversary was an occasion that needed a room. Ellison had agreed with the enthusiasm of a man who enjoys the idea of gestures without necessarily understanding their weight. He'd told Ingrid about it 3 weeks in advance, casually over breakfast. "Prescott's helping me put something together at Meridian. 10th anniversary, 200 people, it'll be a good night." Ingrid had looked up from her coffee. 200 people? Friends, colleagues, the family. Howard's been looking forward to something like this for a while. He paused. "You should find something to wear." That was the conversation. She wore a deep burgundy gown, long-sleeved, understated. She arrived on Ellison's arm and smiled at the people she knew, spoke warmly to the ones she liked, and moved through the evening with the composure of a woman who had already finished grieving something that everyone else still thought was fine. Ellison had arranged for the bracelet presentation at the midpoint of the evening, after the toasts, before dessert. He'd bought it from a jeweler in uptown Charlotte whom his assistant had located. He had paid $12,000 for it, which he considered significant. He had mentioned the price to Prescott and to his brother Clifford, 41, and to Howard, who had clapped him on the shoulder and said, "That's how you do it." What nobody in the room knew, except Ingrid, was that the bracelet's clasp bore a tulip motif that was not the jeweler's design. It was vellum and thorns. It was the signature mark pressed onto every piece produced by her studio, a small, stylized tulip stamped into the closure. It had been Ingrid's choice from the beginning, a personal mark, not widely publicized, but documented, registered. Hers. The bracelet Ellison had purchased for $12,000 was either a replica or a theft. Either way, it was not what he thought it was, and Ingrid had known the moment she opened the box. "Before I answer," she said, her voice carrying just far enough, "I'd like to have it authenticated." Ellison laughed. It was the laugh of a man who assumes the joke is for him. "Ingrid, it's a gift, I know," she said, "and I'd like to know where it came from." Howard materialized at Ellison's elbow. "What's the hold-up? Let the woman enjoy her bracelet." Ingrid turned to look at him, not unkindly but fully. "Mr. Vance," she said, "you mentioned Vellum and Thorn at dinner a few months ago. Do you remember?" Howard blinked. "Sure, great brand." "Ellison, isn't that? The bracelet has their mark on it," Ingrid said. She held it up, the tulip on the clasp. "That's their signature. I'd like to know which Vellum and Thorn authorized retailer sold this piece, because my understanding is that this particular design was not in their current collection." The room had not exactly stopped. People were still talking at other tables. The bar was still pouring, but the circle of people close enough to hear had gone very still. Ellison's expression was shifting through several phases: confusion, irritation, something that looked briefly like fear. "It came from Hargreave and Sons," he said, "the jeweler on Tryon. My assistant." "Hargreave and Sons is not an authorized Vellum and Thorn retailer," Ingrid said. She said it the way someone states a fact they have had ready for some time. Prescott, standing 3 feet away, cleared his throat. "Ingrid," Ellison said, and his voice had dropped into the particular register menus when they want a woman to stop doing what she is doing in public. "This is a gift. Can we just—" "I'm not trying to embarrass you," she said. It was true. Her voice was steady, not cold, not theatrical. "I just need to understand where this piece came from, because the clasp mark belongs to a specific studio, and if someone is selling replicas, that's a problem that affects a lot of people." Howard made a sound of impatience. "This is ridiculous. Ellison, just tell her what you paid and let's move on." "Howard." Doris put her hand on his arm. "It's fine," Ingrid said. She looked at Ellison directly. "I'm not questioning what you paid. I'm questioning what the jeweler sold you." There was a moment, just one, where Ellison looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of understanding, and then it passed, and he looked annoyed instead. "If there's a problem with the bracelet," he said, "I'll deal with it Monday." "I'll make a call tonight," Ingrid said. She took out her phone and stepped 2 feet to the right. She dialed. The person she called answered the second ring, Ingrid's studio director Riva, 42, who had been waiting. The conversation was short. Ingrid asked 2 questions, listened, said thank you, and hung up. When she came back to the circle, Howard was talking to Ellison in a low voice. Prescott had found something interesting to look at on the far wall. The piece is not from Vellum and Thorne's current or archived collection, Ingrid said. The clasp mark was replicated without authorization. Hargreave & Sons has been on a watch list for the studio for the past 4 months. She paused. Ellison, you were sold a forgery. The room around them was not pretending anymore. People were watching openly. Someone put down their dessert fork. Ellison stared at her. How would you even know who to call about that? It was the question she had been waiting for. Not because she had planned to answer it theatrically. She had never wanted any of this to be theater. But because it was the question that opened the door to what had been on the other side of it for 6 years. Because I own the studio, she said. The quiet that followed was the kind that has weight to it. I'm sorry, Ellison said. Vellum and Thorne. She looked at him, and there was nothing in her expression that could be read as triumph, because she didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired. She felt like someone who had carried something a very long way and was finally putting it down. I founded it. I've run it for 6 years. It's mine. Howard made a sound like air going out of something. Doris said, very quietly, oh my God. Ellison did not say anything at all for a long time. The evening did not recover in the way parties sometimes do. Gradually, with music turned up and glasses refilled and the social machinery grinding back into motion, it ended differently. Not with a scene, not with shouting, not with the kind of public collapse that people would describe for years at other dinner tables. It ended with Ingrid setting the bracelet back in its box, closing the lid, and handing it to Ellison with both hands. You should return it Monday, she said, and you should make sure Hargreave & Sons understands the legal exposure they have. Then she turned and walked to the table where Doris was sitting, and she sat down next to her mother-in-law, and she asked if she'd like to step outside for some air. Doris looked at her for a long moment. Then she said yes. They sat on the club's terrace for 40 minutes. The city was below them, lit and moving, indifferent to the particular shape of this particular night. Doris held a glass of water she didn't drink. Ingrid looked at the skyline. How long? Doris asked. 6 years since I launched. Longer since I started building it. And Ellison never. He knew I had a business, Ingrid said. He called it my little side project. Doris put the glass down on the table. She didn't say anything for a while. I used to have something, she said finally. Before Howard and I married, I was doing floral design. Real design, installations, events. I had clients. She paused. Howard thought it was a nice hobby. Ingrid looked at her. I let it go, Doris said. I don't say that to make you feel guilty. I just want you to know I understand more than you might think I do. Ingrid nodded. She looked back at the city. What happens now? Doris asked. I've spoken to an attorney, Ingrid said. I've been speaking to one for several months. She said it quietly. The business is protected. It's been structured that way since the beginning. A pause. The marriage is another question. The weeks that followed were not clean or simple. They rarely are. Ellison went through a phase of anger first, the kind of anger that presents itself as betrayal, but is actually wounded pride. He said things like, you hid this from me, and I had a right to know, and once, in a raised voice that carried further than he intended, who does something like this to their husband? Ingrid listened. She did not apologize. She had considered what she owed him in the way of explanation, and she believed she owed him honesty, so she gave him that. You called it a hobby, she said, every time I talked about it. In front of your father, in front of your friends. You made it clear what you thought it was worth, and I stopped telling you about it because I didn't want what I was building to absorb that. I needed it to stay intact. Ellison did not know what to do with that. He spent several evenings attempting to locate the argument that would reframe the situation in his favor. But there was no angle from which Ingrid had done something wrong by building a successful business. And he was not stupid enough to believe otherwise, even when he was angry. Howard Vance went through his own reckoning somewhat faster because Howard was a practical man, and he recognized, sooner than his son did, that the landscape had shifted. He had spent 8 months admiring a company without knowing he was talking about his daughter-in-law's life's work in front of her face at her own dinner table. When that understanding settled in, really settled, he did something that surprised Ingrid. He called her, not to apologize in the elaborate way of men who want credit for apologizing. He called to say 2 sentences. I should have paid more attention to you as a person, not just as Ellison's wife. I'm sorry I didn't. She thanked him. She meant it. Doris had been texting her quietly since the night of the anniversary dinner. Small things. An article about textile sourcing she thought Ingrid might find interesting. a photo of the silk wrap she'd been given, with a message that just said, "Still my favorite thing I own." Nothing heavy, just presents. It was, in some ways, the kindest thing anyone in that family had done for her in years. The marriage did not end in an explosion. It ended the way Ingrid had understood for some time it would, carefully, with documents, with two people who had spent 10 years building adjacent lives instead of one shared one, and who had finally stopped pretending that proximity was the same as connection. The divorce was filed 4 months after the anniversary dinner. It was uncontested. The settlement was clean because Ingrid's attorney had been thorough, and because Vellum and Thorne had been structured outside the marital estate from its inception, a fact that had required patience and foresight, and the kind of long-horizon thinking that Ingrid had been quietly practicing for most of their marriage. Ellison did not fight it. She thought he might, and she had been prepared for that, but in the end he did not. She believed, though she never said this out loud, that some part of him understood he had never really seen her, and that fighting for what he hadn't seen would have required a kind of self-examination he wasn't ready to do in front of a judge. The licensing deal closed in November. Vellum and Thorne signed with a distribution group that put the studio's pieces in 40 boutiques across 12 states, with a European expansion planned for the following spring. The valuation cleared $85 million. The tulip class became, in the industry press, something of a symbol, shorthand for the idea that quiet persistence had its own kind of force. Ingrid moved to Charleston. She had always preferred it to Charlotte. The light was different, the air was different, the city felt more like itself. She kept the house in Charlotte on the market for 6 weeks before it sold, and on the day the paperwork closed, she stood in the empty kitchen for 3 minutes, not out of sentiment, but because she wanted to leave from there deliberately, eyes open, without hurrying. She built a studio on the edge of downtown Charleston, 3 floors, large windows, a courtyard with a small tulip garden that her head horticulturist had designed, and that she freely admitted was indulgent. The studio had an open floor plan that her team had filled within the first week with the specific organized chaos of people who love what they do. She had coffee every Thursday morning with Reva, her studio director, who had been with her since the 2nd year and who knew the whole arc of the story the way very few people did. "Do you think about it?" Reva asked her once, about 6 months after the divorce was final. "About what specifically? About how long you stayed?" Ingrid thought about it. "I think about who I was when I started building Vellum and Thorne," she said. "I was still married. I was still in that house. I was going to dinners where people asked me what Ellison was working on, and nobody thought to ask what I was working on. And I just kept going." She paused. "I don't think I stayed too long. I think I was building the whole time. I just needed to build enough before I could leave." Reva nodded. "And now?" she asked. Ingrid looked out the studio window at the courtyard below, where the tulips were beginning to come up, the first real bloom of their first real spring in the new space. "Now," she said, "I'm just working." She picked up her coffee. The morning light came through the window, clean and unhurried, and there was a lot of work to do, and she was glad for every single piece of it.